welcome everyone to the third panel of the day, which will look at the role of a forward deployed contact layer of forces in a denied and contested operating environment. You know, if there's a sort of golden thread that runs through, I think, what we've heard today, it's the idea that competition, deterrence, and warfighting are increasingly going to have a degree of simultaneity about them. Forces in the forward layer will need to simultaneously compete and deter. And yet there are open questions about, of course, about what exactly the naval and in particular marine and amphibious forces that form this contact layer will look like, what concepts of operations will guide their use. Today, our two eminent speakers for today are particularly well positioned to provide the answers to some of these questions. First up, we have Brian Clark, who is the director for the Defense Concepts and Technology Center at the Hudson Institute. Brian's work at the Hudson looks at subjects such as autonomy, electronic warfare, naval concepts of operations, and naval force structures, all of which are subjects on which he is widely published and widely read. Prior to becoming a civilian analyst, Brian had a long and illustrious career in the US Navy and served in a number of capacities, including as a special advisor to the then Chief of Naval Operations as part of his Commander's Action Group. Our second speaker for the day, Brigadier Tony Turner, is, of course, Deputy Commandant General of the Royal Marines and Deputy Director of the Littoral Strike, a role in which he's intimately involved in generating some of the sort of amphibious and littoral strike forces, which will form part of the contact layer, which is the subject of today's deployment. Over the course of a longer and illustrious career, Brigadier Turner has held a variety of command roles in theaters such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and in counter-piracy operations off the coast of East Africa, as well as a number of staff roles at the MOD level, most recently serving as assistant head of special operations at the MOD's Security Policy and Operations Directorate. So first of all, thank you both for being here, and I look forward to what I'm sure will be a very engaging discussion. Before I turn over to Brian to lead us off with a talk about how sort of the golden thread that runs through competition and warfighting in the contact layer is the idea of uncertainty, mitigating it for one's own forces, and imposing it on the opponent and sort of securing a decision-centric advantage. I'd just like to remind you of the sort of house rules regarding the lectures, which is that lectures are on the record, but the Q&A session is off the record. And with that, Brian, I'll turn over to you.
Thank you very much, Sid, and thank you very much to RUSI for inviting me to speak here. And it's great to be here with General Turner. It's an honor to be on the same virtual stage. I'm going to share my screen here so that we can, there we go. So can you see the slides? Good, thank you, General. All right, so I'll go to that. So what we've been doing work for the DoD, mostly DARPA, but also other parts of DoD, looking at the idea of how do you gain a decision advantage, given that we think warfare is shifting away from a focus on attrition and towards a focus on gaining decision-making advantages, similar to the shift that we've seen in the past between attrition and maneuver warfare. It's just maneuver warfare today is going to be benefiting from a lot of advancements in information technology and computer processing that maybe previous generations of maneuver warfare enthusiasts didn't have the access to. How that plays out in competition and conflict is something I'm going to talk about today. So we're all familiar with this picture, which I helped generate over at CSBA and is now being used by The Economist in this case, to depict the challenge posed to contact layer forces. You're facing a wide array of long-range precision weapons that can put you at a significant disadvantage. They both slow your arrival into theater, they create an escalation advantage for your opponent, and they can reduce the options available to you, which in the end reduces your decision-making advantage because you're forced to go down a path that an adversary is likely to predict and therefore be able to circumvent. So if you think about how that plays out in terms of escalation advantage, US forces or allied forces operating underneath the umbrella of these long-range weapons, either in Europe or in Asia, are going to either have to go in at high risk and accept the fact that they could be attacked on relatively short notice with large numbers of weapons, or they have to go in with larger packages that can defend themselves, but then might be seen as provocative or escalatory. So in effect, you don't have those middle rungs, as you can see on the chart here, on the escalation ladder, whereas your opponent has lots of rungs, and you can see how China and Russia use those rungs in their gray zone operations today. So this is an example of how the force posture of the Russians and the Chinese present to us a situation where it's hard to get a decision-making advantage because they can largely predict where we're going to operate, how we're going to operate, because they've constrained our options so much, given our force structure and how we do command and control. So that drives us to questions of, okay, well, how do we change that dynamic? How do we get more options to improve our decision-making? So to think of this more theoretically, because of course we're a think tank and we tend to think about things in this very abstract level, to abstract it a little bit, what we're arguing is that we need to think about being more of a decision-centric force. So if you look at the bottom part of this chart, we're trying to maintain our options open as long as possible in a confrontation. This is, heart of like commander's art. Everybody that served in command, we all understand this, but it's challenging when you're in a confrontation and your opponent is actively trying to foreclose options to you. And it's even harder when you're left with a force structure that maybe doesn't have the adaptability or that doesn't have the command and control structure that allows you to exploit the adaptability in your force. You're forced to go then to the upper part of it, which is our more traditional military planning process, at least of the last couple of decades, which is we predict our likely situation in the future. We identify the characteristics we need in the force, and then we efficiently allocate resources towards those characteristics, and then we can allow other resources to be devoted to other tasks. So that forecast-centric approach is very efficient, but it trades that efficiency for a lack of optionality. Whereas if we have a more option-centric force or decision-centric force, it's more adaptable, but it's going to be less efficient than its counterpart. So we're moving in this direction of optionality to get a decision-making advantage. Therefore, we're going to have to think about force design and command and control differently. Force design is going to have to be more adaptive. The command and control is going to have to manage that. So one way that plays out now, and thinking about the contact layer, is we've talked a lot in the U.S. military and other militaries about distribution. Distributing your forces, like this surface force here that's been distributed around the Western Pacific, but increases the number of targets an adversary has to engage. It increases the complexity of the picture for the adversary. It also increases the adaptation possible within your own force. So this idea of increasing your own adaptability while imposing complexity on your opponent is a key aspect of this decision-centric form of warfare. This is sort of inherent to all warfare. We want to try to get a decision-making advantage, but if the warfare construct we're in is more likely to be attrition, just how many things can you kill as fast as possible? Well, distribution is less efficient. So if you were just going to do an attrition fight, there might be better ways to do that. But if you're in a conflict like the ones that Russia and China seem to be proposing to us, which is where they pursue these low-level aggressions and periodically intensify them and then fall back, those are more decision-centric and less focused on attrition. Therefore, we need to think about adapting our forces in a manner that gives us more adaptability and creates more decision-making challenges for them. This also forecloses options to the enemy, right? So if they have to deal with a more distributed force, China in this situation doesn't have the ability to, for example, suppress the operation of an aircraft carrier and thereby suppress the operation of the entire naval force. They have to now think about identifying and then engaging each of these individual force concentrations on their own and defeat them in detail, which forces them into a decision-making challenge of their own. So it creates dilemmas for them. Then if you want this more distributed force, there's some things that sort of fall out of that. One is, as you go to a more distributed force, you can focus your air defenses on the localized area around your forces. So they're all distributed. You don't have to do area defense as much anymore. They can now collapse in their air defense envelopes to a much shorter range where they can use shorter range systems that have higher capacity. Each of those targets now becomes a harder target than it would have been if you were doing an area air defense scheme. That means that your more distributed force now has a harder set of targets in it. It's that many more weapons for an adversary to use to engage it in detail, which again, you're foreclosing options for the enemy because you're forcing him to either go big or stay home, if you will. Then you complement that, you have to think about the fact that, well, the adversary could decide to do that. If you don't have sufficient number of targets, they could say that number of weapons is acceptable. We're just going to attack every one of those targets. To make that even harder, you've got to think about increasing the number of potential targets through counter ISR. So the use of electromagnetic decoys. So in this example, we're showing a force of real ships moving up to the north, up to the northeast. Simultaneously, some decoy ships are down to the southwest. And then you also have some jamming that's going on to protect the actual forces from being detected and identified. So this combination of things creates a more complex picture for the enemy. It doesn't perfectly hide the real forces, but because the real forces and the fake forces are both protected with electronic warfare, they can both be sufficiently obscured so it's hard to differentiate between them. As a result, the target set just increased, and it's hard for the opponent to tell which is real and which isn't. This makes more targets for them to engage, increases their complexity, and drives them to a decision-making disadvantage. Again, you don't want to then reveal yourself by how you do your own sensing. So it's imperative that we also look at other ways of detecting targets other than our kind of monostatic radar model that we tend to use. So shifting towards low probability of intercept, low probability of detection, monostatic testing or sensing rather, radars that use very narrow beams and very short pulse widths and very low power. And then also passive sensing, whether it's passive geolocation or it's signals intelligence, can all give you ways to detect the enemy without you revealing yourself in the process. This helps add to the complexity that you're imposing on your adversary and is essential if you're going to operate these contested areas in the contact layer. Another part of contact layer that's going to be very important is mining and mine clearing. I think we tend to forget about this, but if you are going to operate in the contact layer, it tends to be a littoral environment. You're going to have to think about how you're going to clear mines the opponent might put in there, and then also use mining as a way to constrain the opponent's movements and gate a decision-making advantage. That is increasingly shifting to unmanned systems, with host vessels being merely the platform that gets them there and then manages the command and control of them. So we're seeing this shift towards unmanned systems to be used for mining and mine clearing almost exclusively. One other thing we found in our analysis, and we put a report on this last year, is that in contested environments like the contact layer, aircraft carriers are constrained in their force generation or their sortie generation capacity because they are being harassed, essentially. So they're not going to get sunk by things like anti-ship ballistic missiles or anti-ship cruise missiles necessarily, but it prevents them from generating sorties at the level that they can and are used to doing. And it turns out that in a lot of those situations, your surface combatants can generate more fires and sustain them more effectively than the aircraft carrier can. So we have to think about, this more distributed force of surface combatants and submarines with missiles is probably a more effective tool for power projection, at least in the short term, than the aircraft carrier that we've tended to rely on as kind of the heart of our contact layer force. And that carrier might be something that's in a layer back, like the blunt layer or the surge layer, and comes in once we've sort of reduced the threat to the point where the carrier can generate sufficient sorties. That carrier can then shift its focus from strike and anti-surface warfare to supporting with air defense and close air support the naval forces in the region. So that contact layer force that's now trying to defend itself at a very small scale with short range air and missile defense probably needs some assistance to do the longer range air defense. And forces on the ground are going to need something to prevent them from air attack. So places like the Philippines, other parts of the first island chain, you can think about this also being the case in Europe as well. Providing the air support for them is probably a really important mission now for carriers that can have the range and mobility to do that, but can operate from a place where they're able to generate sorties because they're outside the range of the opponent's missiles and most of their naval forces, because they tend to be closer to shore coastal forces. And then a mission that's really important to think about in these environments is ASW, anti-submarine warfare. We have found in our research that we can shift almost entirely the ASW mission to unmanned systems. And that's because we have to think of the metrics differently. So anti-submarine warfare is fundamentally about suppressing submarines more than killing the submarine, just because the level of effort needed to kill the submarine is so much higher than the level of effort you need to suppress it. Unmanned systems are very good at that suppression mission. And because it's a slow moving mission, you're able to keep humans in the loop through human command and machine control. So you can see detection, tracking, and engagement we see as something that unmanned systems can do, a lot of which could be based ashore or hosted ashore. So in a littoral environment like an island chain, the Marine forces, for example, in a place like the Philippines, could be doing anti-submarine warfare. And I've talked about doing this in the US maritime, or rather in the US Marines. And then last thing here is on command and control structures. So one thing that we're going to find in these contact layer environments is an extremely contested electromagnetic spectrum environment. Part of that is what we're going to be imposing on the enemy. So using jamming, using decoys, using passive sensing, because we recognize it's going to be a contested environment. But also then our command and control structures are going to need to think about, we're going to have to adapt our command and control to our communications availability, instead of trying to make a command and control structure that's stable, and then we build a comms network that's able to be resilient to support it. That hierarchical structure, which is what we tend to try and use today, that's in B up here on this chart, will not work in these contested environments, because you'll quickly lose the ability for the boss to be able to talk to the subordinates. Mission command is what we would then use, which is essentially this hierarchical structure where you devolve command down to the organizational node that's got the right visibility and is able to talk to the forces under their command. And then what's incumbent upon us is to have the decision support tools for that commander to be able to operate effectively in the contested environment with those forces. It can't just do it based on tactics and doctrine that they learned or that they've gained through habit, because the opponent can figure that out and predict it. So if you want to be predictable and gain the decision-making advantage, those mission commanders have to be equipped with tools that allow them to look at the whole range of options available to them, rather than simply following the playbook that they've been given or have used in the past. And so for that, I'm going to turn it back over. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And Sid, back over to you.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Brian, for a really fascinating intervention. And, I thought your points about increasing the number of nodes in the system and sort of preparing to cope with an environment in which our networks really doesn't work really resonated with some of the points that have been raised earlier today. So now, second up, we have Brigadier Turner, who's going to talk about some of the work the Future Commando Force has done to kind of translate these concepts of operations into military lines of effort. So, sir, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Brian. That was a fantastic introductory pitch, and I hope that the audience and you will see some parallels between what you say and what I'm about to brief, albeit some of the detail on how we're going to tackle some of those considerable threats won't be covered in specifically. So I'm delighted and privileged to be asked to speak to you today. As Sid has already mentioned, my current role covers both Deputy Director of Littoral Strike and Deputy Commandant General of the Royal Marines. Between those two pillars, I'm responsible for supporting the force generation of our amphibious forces and the delivery of our Future Commando Force programme. So I've been asked to talk about the role of the Future Commando Force in a forward positioned contact layer and the likely composition of the elements which will make this up. The two caveats up front on what I'll discuss are, firstly, the Future Commando Force remains a concept, and currently it is being examined by the Ministry of Defence in its programme approvals and scrutiny process. And equally, as you'll be aware, and as the Fleet Commander mentioned earlier today, the UK is currently going through its final stages of its 5-yearly integrated review. The outcome of that review will determine the level of ambition of the FCF programme and illustrate the scale and pace at which we can transform ourselves. So what I'm describing you today remains a pre-decisional proposition, albeit one that's attracted significant support and enthusiasm thus far. The second caveat is that while the proposition is threat-driven, I'll not be covering the types of threat that the Future Commando Force may encounter in detail. There's much external literature on this, and Brian has already alluded to it, and not least RUSI itself has examined it, specifically Sidharth, his own paper, which he published on it very recently. So I won't touch on that too much, but hopefully what I'll be offering you will prompt some exploratory questions. So why change? Well, today's global security environment has three broad characteristics that demand change. Firstly, the blurring of the distinction between peace and war, resulting in near continuous sub-threshold violent and non-violent competition. Two, the diversification of actors spanning state, non-state, military and civilians, conventional and unconventional forces. And thirdly, the rapid proliferation of constantly evolving technologies, which have the potential for transformative effects on conflict. I think the combination of these broad factors means that there's a real risk that our freedom of movement and the freedom of movement of international commerce, as well as the freedom of maneuver of our security forces, can be threatened. And I think the fleet commander commented on these in his speech earlier this afternoon. I think these trends are driving wholesale change in the manner that the UK is envisaging the continuing of national security and defence. What I describe today is how the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines are adapting to these challenges to better support UK national integrated operating concepts. So the UK's Future Commando Force seeks to evolve the current construct to meet the spectrum of ambiguous but no less lethal threats. It will do so by delivering a persistently forward deployed maritime-enabled advanced force in areas of national and strategic importance. Its forward basing and persistent presence will allow it to better understand the operating and operational context, and the range of capabilities it will contain will allow it to adapt to circumstances and offer decision makers options and sustain itself forward without immediate commitment. And I think Brian immediately before me outlined the reasons why those factors are important. So to achieve some of this, we're building an agile and adaptive force, which is engaged, scalable, and interoperable across the spectrum of conflict. We'll explore this contact layer in the remainder of my presentation. But some headline assumptions first. As an amphibious commando force, we will focus in the littoral domain in the first instance. National interests in the freedom of movement for trade, our security interests, and access to the global commons would therefore point to the global maritime highways and their respective choke points as our key areas of focus. The confluence of land and maritime features, international borders and airspace, overlaid with civilian, commercial, and military locations and activities, not to mention the information space, make the operating environment increasingly complex. This complexity requires greater investment in relationships with regional partners and allies through presence, meaningful activity to build understanding, insight, and trust. And finally, uncertain or unclear threats and actors mean that investment in phase 0, pre-crisis understanding, is a near constant activity now. However, this is offset with political difficulties of having permanent presence of large-scale forces in politically sensitive areas and regions. So with those assumptions in mind, how do I interpret the term contact layer? In trauma medicine, contact layers are non-adherent and permeable membranes that are used to protect fragile tissues. I think these terms are really useful to explore the FCF concept. By non-adherent, I think this captures a key characteristic of the Future Commando Force. Its strength remains in its inherent maritime mobility, offering the ability to maneuver across large areas in periods of darkness or in a matter of days. With access to sea-based sustainment and organic all-arms capabilities, this means that they offer options and effects across a large operating area. Their non-adherent nature provides choice without commitment, as I've already alluded to, which is particularly attractive to our political decision makers, especially when stakes and uncertainty are high. I think the term permeable describes a force that establishes relationships and seeps into existing networks. Examples being liaison and exchange programs with partner forces, integrating with existing partners across government and defence-wide international networks, highly demanding defence engagement when the expertise is demanded or sensitivities exist, training and exercise with partner nations, and of course, operational deployments. These outputs will be delivered by the 4 deployed elements that we are calling littoral response groups. These are a combination of maritime platforms, dedicated aviation, commando forces, and when required, other joint capabilities. The maritime elements of the littoral response group will compose of at least 2 amphibious ships capable of embarking aviation, launching smaller surface vessels such as landing craft, and in due course they will also host a variety of airborne, surface and subsurface unmanned systems. These ships will deploy with escorts as required. The littoral response groups will be able to disperse their capabilities in their own areas of operation and then aggregate for specific operations. The ability to disperse and to support multiple smaller tasks will allow the activities described above to occur concurrently, context dependent. The intent is that 2 littoral response groups will also be able to force generate into a larger littoral strike group in the event of crisis, escalation, or as part of a multinational response. However, routinely, the littoral response groups will operate independently, focusing on their own specific areas of interest. The aviation detachment will comprise of Merlin Mark IV troop-carrying aircraft and then the Wildcat reconnaissance fire and control aircraft. Dependent on amphibious shipping, the LRG will also be able to accommodate CH-47s and H-64, increasing heavy lift and fires respectively. We're also exploring a variety of medium lift drones capable of operating from the littoral response group, providing data and communications links, ISR, EW, and the prospect of ship-to-shore sustainment. The commando force will be built around a ground combat element, which will offer tactical command and control, intelligence fusion, particularly with partners across government, and deliver find and strike operations. The commando force will have enhanced surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities intrinsic to its organisation through the training, technology, and SOPs that we'll be providing. However, each littoral response group will also have highly specialist reconnaissance elements that deliver electronic surveillance and advanced force operations. As I've already mentioned, we're also aggressively pursuing unmanned systems and autonomy to enhance these elements and our surveillance capabilities. We're also building some unique teams, or at least unique to us, called SALT and MLAT teams, who will be able to act independent or in conjunction with the littoral response groups. The SALT teams deliver specialist support, advice, liaison, or training to partners, particularly focusing on commando skills, amphibious operations, and operations in extreme environments, such as cold weather or mountainous terrain. The MLAT, or Maritime Liaison and Assessment Team, offer expert planners able to support embassies, joint planning staffs, maritime battle staffs, or allies in particular regions. For fires, the littoral response groups will have access to organic tactical precision strike systems, delivering either indirect fire or remote piloted systems capable of striking, as well as gaining access to shipborne systems, which, as Brian's already mentioned, may be more available and useful in contested littorals than shipborne carrier-borne aircraft. That said, AH-64, when integrated and allocated, as well as carrier-borne assets, can be used by our commando force elements whilst ashore. Networking all of these capabilities and exploring the opportunity presented by autonomous and swarming technologies will allow us to explore enhanced lethality whilst reducing the density of forces committed to shore. Sustainment will be from the sea base, as of course will be medical support. The planning mark is for 28 days of supply, which will be more achievable given our shipping size by slimming down the force package and lightening our vehicle fleet load. Mobility force, speaking of vehicles, we'll see a migration to ultralight and light mobility platforms for rapid insertion, with our future all-terrain vehicle offering all-terrain, low-pressure, protected mobility for operations in demanding terrain requiring force protection whilst ashore. Critical to enabling all of I've described above is an integrated data and communications network, which allows multiple different bearers to share a common operating picture, ingest and process inputs from a variety of sensors, and deliver command and control products to enable constituent elements of the future commando force to synchronize and deconflict effects whilst dispersed. So how does this contact layer scale up to respond to a crisis? Of course, it will be context dependent and driven, but accepting that a full deployed littoral strike group or commando force will only be part of an answer, not the full answer to a crisis. Here are some of the options. During the road to crisis, we'll provide support to strategic collection, providing capability and capacity, enhancing our national sensors and complementing these with tactical collection in areas of focus or blind spot. We'll be able to coordinate and cooperate with regional partners and allies to deliver effect, reinforce those partners, contain adversaries through presence, and of course change the risk calculus by holding enemy capabilities at risk through overt or discrete activity to demonstrate or shape the adversary's decision cycle. At the point of crisis, we provide deployed very high readiness force elements in a region. We offer maneuverable, connected, scalable, sovereign command and control. We can inform and refine targets in conjunction with national planners. We can conduct strategic collect, deception, shaping, and advanced force operations. At the point of conflict, we can provide a pre-landing force to shape conditions across the domains to create advantage for any follow-on force activity. Against a sub-peer actor, we can conduct sovereign or independent operations to facilitate access into denied spaces, shaping the information environment, geographical control, neutralizing threats, and provide access to key installations. Against a peer adversary, we can act in coalition and as part of a multinational joint force, contributing to the A2AD battle as an advance and shaping force, and ultimately providing options to a joint commander by creating the necessary fissures to be exploited by other capabilities. So by way of a summary, I think the UK is embarking on a holistic and far-reaching programme to recalibrate its commando forces and its littoral strike capabilities. Where we operate, with whom we operate, and how we operate are all evolving, leading to a more networked model, employing a broader array of sensors, a greater blend of autonomy at the tactical level, smaller, more agile force elements with access to systems delivering precision, strike, and lethality over much longer ranges. The Future Commando Force is a mature but evolving concept. However, I think you'll agree we're on an exciting journey to transform how the UK delivers operational effects in the littoral. In the past, the Royal Marines motto was per mare per terram, by sea, by land. I think in the future, that is probably too narrow a definition, and our commando forces will need to be able to operate by sea, by air, by land, in cyber and electronic battle spaces, using strength and guile, harnessing technology, and creating problems for our adversaries. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
Brigadier, thank you very much for that really insightful look into the Future Commando Force program. And thank you to both of you for two really, I think, engaging and educational presentations. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience feels the same way.